Good, good. My name is Nicole Dumaguindin. I was born in Long Beach, raised in the IE, Riverside County. Heads up to IE folks. Did my undergrad UCR, master's USC, worked in the Philippines for 2 years, came back, and now I work in community mental health for the Filipino community, API in general, Riverside County, doing health education outreach, and then I'm also a member of FANHS OCIE.
And I'm Jenna Colde. I am a second year graduate student doing my master's in clinical psychology at California Lutheran University. I also did my undergraduate at UC San Diego. I was born in West Covina, actually, hence me kind of having a little shout out in the corner, and then grew up relatively in this area in the Inland Empire. And us three, we make up, along with a group of others, we make up what the long name of Filipino American National Historical Society, or FANHS for short. And we'll get into more information about FANHS itself, but as you see this afternoon, we're going to be doing a nice little workshop with all of you, talking about storytelling to decolonizing mental health. Now, I do want to preface this because I feel this too. I know it's after lunch, and I know that everything's digesting, so we really made this intentionally a way for us to really engage and be a little bit more active with this workshop. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. So as we are talking about storytelling, that also requires us to tell our story, use our words. So we're actually going to set aside the first 10 to 15 minutes with the folks around you. Share a memory about your most interesting day at elementary school. Think about maybe what was like 4th grade like, what was kindergarten like. Trying to tap into kind of just what was the early part of your life? What were some of the formative moments for you? And we'll go from there, and then we might be sharing a little bit after that. So we'll give you all, let's say, 15 minutes. So, and all right, we'll put some music on.
All right, so I forgot to mention I'm originally from the Bay Area, and then I went to Chico State for my undergrad in electrical engineering. Ended up going into special education, where I now get to engineer future engineers and give them personality support. I'm just kidding. I can say that because I'm electrical. But I did get my master's in special education through Long Beach. During the pandemic, I did my thesis on mindfulness on effects of math anxiety in students with disabilities. So the information that we're showing you today is very close to my heart, and it's work that I do as well for myself. So for those of you that aren't familiar, there have been several waves of Filipino American immigration. There's definitely this presentation here that we reference actually goes through the 7 waves. So even going from Spain and China, going into the Philippines, and the Philippines to the United States. But for sake of time, I really recommend clicking on that. We gave Sarah Lynn the link. Hopefully we'll get that out to you all very soon. But what we're going to really talk about is how we, as our generations go by, we're carrying the hopes and dreams of our families. One of the first waves that we had coming in the late 1800s was the Filipino farm workers. They were brought in to Hawaii to be working the plantations over there, sugarcane, pineapple, etc. They then also moved into California, working the fields. With Watsonville, they had the riots over there with actually one of the first Filipinos being killed because, unfortunately, the Caucasian population thought we were taking away their jobs, as well as the women in the community, was what the accusations were. We also have a very high number in the 1920s-ish, really where nurses started coming in. So to uplift the little brothers of the United States, we were considered nationals of the US, very similar to Puerto Rico currently. So once the Philippine-Spanish War happened, the US stepped in with imperialism, and we became part of the US. To, civilize us, they actually brought members of the Philippine elite to the United States in hopes of educating them on democracy and then having them go back to the Philippines and teach democracy to the Filipinos there. With that, they also wanted to increase the number of medical students in medical field, and nursing was the area that they chose for Filipinos, because we do caretake our families really well, and that's a very important aspect of our culture. So that's one of the reasons there are so many Filipino nurses here. There are references towards the end of this presentation as well, if you'd like to explore that a little more. And then, of course, going into the 1940s, we see a lot of the military. Unfortunately, because of our standing as Filipinos, we were not allowed to go into officer positions. For many Filipinos, we were relegated to the galley as chefs and cooks. Also stewards. So stewards were the ones that would basically be the personal butlers of the officers. They were not allowed to really move up into the ranks until later on towards the end of the war. And then, of course, we have the history of the U.S. servicemen, the Death March to Bataan, a lot of different historical contexts that were there, but that's what brought a lot of people over after World War II, was because of the military. And then in the 60s, with the Civil Rights Acts going on and different movements going on here in the United States, some of the immigration did let up, and they allowed more Filipinos to come back into the United States. I forgot to mention, the US liberated the Philippines in 1946. We were able to gain our independence from the Philippines, from the United States. And so we became our own sovereign republic. Jumping back in time travel, back in the late 60s, early 70s, this is when companies would recruit the educated engineers, business people, nurses, of course, from the Philippines to come to the United States. And this is really what they call the brain drain, was where we're starting to see people in the Philippines that were highly educated were being recruited not only to the United States, but to other countries. And as you know, here in current times, we do have a lot of overseas workers. It's actually the biggest part of the GDP in the Philippines is the dollars and money coming in from overseas workers that are coming from all over the world, basically, at this point. Another really interesting thing you guys may know, may not know, but a lot of the call centers that we have for the United States companies are actually located in the Philippines, because the Filipinos they have formal English classes. So most of the classes are taught in English in the Philippines, and that is why they have a lot of call centers out there, because our language is better than some other spaces. So they have a lot of call centers that are located in the Philippines. Of course, with the time difference, they're actually working overnight over there, because it'll be daytime for us. So just some things to think about of the history of how colonization, imperialism, some of the messages that society has already started putting out for us, and how it continues to linger in our psyche. And I'm going to pass it off next to Natalie to talk about some of this.
Hi. Okay, so the title of our presentation, recap, it's Storytelling to Decolonize Mental Health. The act of decolonization, you have to understand what happened, what did the oppressor do to the people or the country, and then decolonize mental health. So what was the mental health situation of folks? So this is really helpful to just juxtapose the history of that, whether it's colonization, imperialism, basically the oppressor creating massive trauma to the community, and how does that impact the mind, the heart, and the soul of the people, whether it was the damage caused and simultaneously the healing that the people took into their own hands. I was driving on my way here and was like, wow, it'd be really cool to share this thought that the medicine of the oppressed will always overcome the poison of the oppressor. So take that in mind very poetically and metaphorically as we look at back in the Philippine context, right? And this can apply for other communities around the world too, but the roots of mental health stigma, these caricatures that demonize mental health can be rooted as far back as the onset of colonization in the Philippines, right? Where Jose Rizal, he's an author, he wrote a piece in response to the atrocities Spain inflicted on the Philippines, and one of the main characters that emerged and continues to haunt Philippine mental health is a woman called Sisa, a mother named Sisa, who basically suffered from depression. Her children went missing, and it led to severe depression and eventually episodes of psychosis, right? So this caricature, as you can see, continues to haunt Philippine mental health when the National Center, like flash forward, 1887, Katipunan launches the revolution, blah, 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 blah. The National Center for Mental Health is established in the 1920s, Western-oriented, and who was the forefront monument in front of that in Mandaluyong? It's CISA, right? So at this point in time, mental health in the 1920s was very much a colonized perspective on what healing should be, and at the same time, of course, there's strings attached to the fact that it is still very much Western-oriented, and you can even say anti-female, right? But flash forward towards the 1960s, 70s, what was happening? Marcos dictatorship, but at the same time, folks were starting to rise up, whether they were in the countryside, the cities, and even in academia. So what was happening in the colleges was people were trying to nationalize education, saying that, okay, even though the US set up these education systems, let's bring our roots up, let's uplift our roots, right? Whether it was language, it was sciences, and what emerged was called Psicologia Filipino, in essence, Filipino psychology. So they introduced terms like kapwa, bayanihan, things that you can't translate easily into English, but were terms that resonated with the hearts and minds of Filipinos, right? Flash forward, 1986, it's a people power. We finally ousted the US Marcos dictatorship of that time frame, right? Flash forward several decades later, we are in 2018, and that is when the Mental Health Act was signed into law in the Philippines, where basically it was a bill that was finally passed to say, yes, we should fund programs that prevent instead of stigmatize, criminalize, and make money off of mental health conditions the Filipino people were facing, right? And then flash forward 2022, right? Sometimes history rhymes, repeats, whatever you want to call it. Bongbong Marcos becomes president, Sara Duterte becomes vice president, and now we're in the situation, well, let's continue building on that momentum of healing. Whether we are here in the Philippines or here in the diaspora, the act of social justice is very much tied to mental health, and again, thank you all for being here. I hope this kind of connects the dots between social justice and taking care of our mental health.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then in this case, as we're talking about, we just had the whole, just the brief history of our people. And then for those of you in the seats right now, also just kind of think about your family, think about you as an individual, if there's things that are resonating with you. And so one of the things that we think about when it comes to kind of telling our story is, I hate to kind of bring it to just reality, but sometimes our story is not exactly that pretty. So when it comes to just having expectations, just the hopes and dreams. So for example, I'd love to share a little bit of my story. I'm hoping to kind of go into the field of psychology, hopefully kind of contribute to like mental health and therapy, whatever, for my people. But I'm also faced with the reality that at my master's program, I'm the only Filipino American. I'm not having these kind of conversations with people around me. If anything, I'm kind of stuck with, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is having to assimilate, having to kind of almost kind of whitewash a little bit of my picture in order for me to move in, which is also sadly a response to greater levels of racism, sexism, oppression, and just layers of systemic injustices that are placed against us. So the bullet point here for straddling of worlds, again, we're going to be talking about this, is just there's this process of acculturation. For those of you who kind of identify, I like to say the insert culture here dash American. If you have that experience, maybe you've all kind of had your own instances of it, of, okay, maybe you were too American with relatives or people of your parents' culture, but then again, if you're with your Caucasian friends or friends here that are mainly in America, you might be a little bit too foreign for them. So with that in mind, if anyone is brave, is anyone confident in kind of sharing if if that's a situation that you kind of identify with, are any of you comfortable with like giving an example? Have there been moments where you kind of felt like you were in like this awkward in between? Yeah, thank you so much. I want to also just affirm your bravery in that, because I think what I'd like for you to know in particular, that you're actually speaking stories of the masses. It just hasn't been really talked about in a lot of spaces. And hopefully for all of you today, like this has been a space where you can actually explore a lot of that, not only just taking in the education of the resources provided for you, but knowing that each and every one of you are going to be a community as you go into the school year, and being free to tell these kind of stories. And we can do maybe like one or two more. Anyone is, for some of you too, you're all kind of continuing to think about your story too. And I remember before this, I was talking to Sarah, and I know some of you kind of also have your ideas of like stigma and mental health. And so I'm just gonna cover it relatively briefly. And then, sorry, I'm gonna like plug myself real quick. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, this is actually more of my realm. I'm part of the Asian American Psychological Association, so all of this going into the research or what's being done, you're more than welcome to chat with me after. So going back into his presentation, when we're thinking about stigma, particularly in the Filipino American lens, there is a sense of, there's stigma that is also within spiritual religious roots, and maybe for some of you in your other cultures, there's kind of that like traditional Eastern medicine, or maybe just bouts of like witchcraft and whatnot. There is an article, I believe it was in 2008, when it was talking about Filipino Americans who identified as religious, whether that be Catholic or Christian. They were 5 times more likely to seek the guidance and professional help of a clergy member than a mental health professional. And so part of that comes with just the relation with the church. It also comes with lack of resources and education. And again, it's also coming from generations and generations of psychology was still seen as the Western thing. It wasn't seen as a universal thing. And so continuing off of that, there's also this idea of, I'll kind of group this together. You've all probably heard of model minority, and trying to kind of explore like, oh, like we as an Asian American people, like we were able to assimilate and show success. There's all that was embedded in us too. And then we have what's called colonial mentality, where again, coming from our people, where we've had the waves of Spanish colonialization and American colonialization, there was just this denigration of our Filipino self. So I know in some of your stories you mentioned like, oh, I don't know much about my culture, and it might not even be, I don't want to out myself. Like I prefer the things that are more westernized, or why is my standards of beauty based off of a white thin woman? Or just saying that where our people are coming from is considered less than of the colonizers. So that's actually kind of also a growing field in psychology as well. What does it look like to really define that, and what's kind of causing our affinity towards that? And then so all of what we're saying is a lot of really systemic things, which leads to feelings of shame, guilt, depression, and anxiety.
Can I share a little bit about
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I do joke with my students. I tell them they can call me Tita Ting. That's what they call me on campus. For those that have that participate in different clubs that we have. And I joke with them that, being Filipina and being raised Catholic, I actually have double guilt. I have a really hard time saying no. I have a hard time because my mom expected us to be the upholders of the community, upholders of things like that. And if we were less than, it was not okay. Right? Growing up, once again, we didn't speak Tagalog at home because my parents didn't want me to have an accent. My parents came in the 70s. I was born in 75, before many of you here. So I do know it was a little bit different world. I always tell my children, like, we didn't have Ranch 99. We actually had to I lived in the East Bay of the Bay Area, and we had to take BART into either Oakland Chinatown or San Francisco Chinatown. my dad would actually have to bring things from the Philippines. Like, we knew he was coming from the Philippines because it always had the deal or dried fish. You could smell it coming out of the car. Because we didn't have that, those things weren't there. And this surgery put off for 8 years of this Achilles tendon because I'm so busy taking care of other people. I had children, and my mom ended up, she has dementia now. She may have had different mental health things, but it was never talked about. When we were younger, it was like, oh, your auntie may have been possessed by a demon, or so-and-so's Lola like lost their mind because whatever, it was, you know, they had to go to the priest to pray it off, right? And so now that I have this time that I'm home and unpacking these things, so I'm caring for my mom, who now has dementia and other things going on, but I also have a son with autism. And so the neurodivergence is coming out, and in talking with other parents that are, as a special education teacher and as a parent, it's a hard place to fit because our older generations is like, why can't you control your kid, right? Why can't you be, you know, why can't your kid like just be quiet? And so you have all these feelings of guilt that you're not doing enough, that you are. And for many of us, we've learned coping strategies. It may not be the healthiest, but some of us are unpacking this generational, intergenerational stuff. So you're not alone in these stories, as we mentioned earlier. And once again, thank you to those young people that shared earlier. I too don't feel that I'm not American enough, I'm not Filipino enough, I'm not enough. But in this process, hopefully today, we can help take you towards those so that you can find that for yourself.
Well, I love the slide, and I love just kind of the way that we're facilitating, because it throws in a lot of anecdotes and very telling on where we are in the community, whether it's like academia, education. I'm in like the grassroots education nonprofit industrial complex, right? And it's cool because my work, we do Asian Pacific mental health outreach and education, and it looks so different throughout. So for example, a lot of my East Asian coworkers, they'll go out into the field, and where they find their community is at the Chinese schools in Riverside County. That's their first place to go. You talk to my Vietnamese coworker, she'll say, oh, we go to the Lao Thai and Vietnamese temples. You talk to me, I say, yeah, I go to the Filipino parties and like the Catholic masses. It is very different, and it goes down to, again, the model minority myth. The county needs to understand, and a lot of folks need to understand that when you do mental health education outreach, when you decolonize mental health, it is not one size fits all. Part of the model minority myth is saying that one size does fit all, but that's not the reality, right? What works for us does not work for like Pacifica folks, right? And how do we get them in the room is we voice through solidarity and a lot of other things. And even the symptoms, the emotional and behavioral symptoms, they will look very, very different. There's very different vocabulary depending on who you talk to. So when we do this work, it's definitely intergenerational. It's definitely a work that is collective, and it respects where everybody's histories and communities are at and where they have come from. Yeah, activities.
This is the good stuff. This is good stuff.
Am I? Cool. So this is how we unpack, right? We unpack intergenerational trauma to turn it into intergenerational healing. So y'all are gonna go into your breakout groups, identify the difficult emotion that y'all have individually, right? We all have difficult emotions. It's a reality. We cannot silence it, it is there. And just translate it into the language you're most comfortable with, Gen Z language, foreign language, calligraphy, drawing, whatever, mean it. And then you will free write to the different prompts that you have on your paper. Free writing can be doodling, it can be actual words, it can be lines, it can be colors, whatever you feel, right? And some of the prompts include, what does that emotion, that very difficult emotion, want or need? What is it communicating? What is the noble cause of that difficult emotion? So like, yes.
So I've done workshops with a company called Productive Learning, and one of the things that they talk about us is that emotions are really energy, they're feelings. one of the things that we talk about is that emotions, really what happens a lot in our culture is that we find something to distract ourselves. Instagram, TikTok, well, I just don't want to deal with it. But what happens is that energy keeps building as you stuff it down, right? However, if you look at feelings and emotions as data, it's informing you of your state, right? And if you really look and deal with it, hopefully that energy dissipates or you're able to deal with it. It takes about 90 seconds if you're able to be there. What the noble cause of that emotion is really what is that emotion protecting you from? Or what is that emotion informing you of? For example, and really no emotion or feeling is good or bad. It is data. Okay? It's telling you something. For example, typically when you're angry, it's because something has crossed your values. Something is not comfortable, you are not okay with it. What is a challenge is how you respond to that. Fear. Fear is, once again, a survival mechanism. What is it that you're afraid of? Is it the fear of making a mistake? Is it a fear of looking like you're not adept at what you're doing? Something very personal for me is anxiety, when I'm anxious about something. Fear and anxiety for me go hand in hand. My noble cause for that is because it shows that I care about the outcome. If I'm anxious about this presentation, if I'm anxious about having a tough, difficult conversation, it's because I'm worried that the other person won't accept me. And then you can kind of break it apart from there. What is the noble cause of that emotion that you're having?
Well, thank you, Ate. And then, so after you've identified that noble cause, right, we're delving a little deeper into these feelings, these emotions. I want you to write a love letter to that difficult emotion. So like, validate it, give it some tenderness, compliment it, right, things. Show it some affection and love, and like just recognize that although you're really difficult, I still recognize and care about you too. Right? And then the last prompt is, what would your ancestors share and say with you, or say to you, right? What would it be? Advice? Would it be a song, lullabies, right? Is it a folk tale? What sort of medicine would your ancestors bring up or recommend? Any stories, or like what would that empathy look like? Do you want to?
Yeah, and just one more thing, and then we'll do what you need to do. I want to acknowledge, because I remember when we were planning this, just me internally, if like the love letter thing or kind of writing to yourself and all that is kind of awkward, I understand that, because I remember when I would work with clients when it comes to trying to kind of express themselves, it's like, why would I say like, oh, like I'm loved and validated? Well, it's also a really good practice when you are now starting to think about your self-care materials, thinking about, well, would you say like, you know, you'd say something kind to your friend, and it might be easier to come out that way, but what does it look like to say those same exact words? So like, oh, if you're telling friend A, like, oh, you're amazing, I trust you, and you're like, I'm really grateful for you. Now what does it look like to say those same exact words with the same exact impact back to you? And you're actually worthy of that as well. So yeah, I think that's really legit, and then we'll give it time and background music. And then we'll reconvene in a few. All right. So we need 2 brave volunteers to share what this was like for them. Anyone? I like it when you all share. Or maybe what was. And I just want to touch on that real quick. So I remember I was taught that the definition of grace is unmerited favor. So what does it look like for you to have favor, have provision, have you know, just giving yourself a pep talk because you're deserving of it. And then, which actually ties nicely to our decolonizing self-care. So I define decolonizing self-care as making it 2 things, accessible and communal. I don't know if you've all seen in, maybe even just in social media feeds, or the concept of self-care has really been kind of showing up in the past few years in like quote unquote mainstream society, but a lot of it has been really synonymous with like, treat yourself, because I mean, I like that show, I really do. I love Parks and Recreation, but, like treat yourself, you know, doing the bubble bath and like treating yourself to chocolate. That's not saying it's bad, but the approach that I want you to all see is that how very individualized that is. And so part of that is obviously like it's self-care, like it's in the word itself. However, when it comes to decolonizing self-care, it's to kind of look at your roots. It's kind of to go back to the place where you find your center. And for a lot of us here, maybe that might be your community. That might be the thing that you're actually not doing it alone. And so that's why self-care is in a way kind of a paradox where it's actually not like really about yourself in some weird way. I know that's a weird definition, but all that to say is that when you're going back to self-care, you're coming back into your center, you're thinking about the community around you, you're thinking about who's your squad here on campus, who are the people you are going to, maybe along with professionals. And for those of you, and this is where I will speak a little bit about myself. Who are the people around you that you trust with that are not your family? Because maybe for some of us here that family may still be kind of a sensitive or tender subject for you. And then what I mean by like accessibility, so once upon a time I used to work in Los Angeles, and you know, I was kind of more on the west side, so I would just see all these like, you know, the whole self-care yoga thing for like $300 a month, or doing all these energy things. And while that does work for people, and that I'm not negating that in any way, that's not an accessible way for people to receive self-care. Self-care is for all. And for those of us who are here and working with your mentees and whatnot, trying to find ways that you all can take care of yourself. And they also have a lot of free resources for all of you. Let me see what I put here. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Right, cool. So very, very important note, right? When we decolonize self-care, we don't want to colonize or reappropriate or re-traumatize where those self-care practices originally came from. So it's really important to understand the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural respect for the ways that we try to care for ourselves. So like, for example, I really don't want y'all to go and buy sage off of Amazon and split yourself with it, right? If y'all are familiar, right, sage, white sage is very sacred medicine. It is being poached. It is also very potent medicine. It's important that it is good medicine too, right? You don't want to try and cleanse yourself with something that's dirty, right? And it's also really rewarding to just dig deep into like, oh, what were our ancestors using? So for example, in our ancestry, we burned bayabas leaves to cleanse a space. So that's something we would use. Guava bayabas leaves to cleanse a space. Right, and for example, like, I don't know if y'all see trending, but there's this thing called like yoga and wine that this white woman like culturally appropriated and is like promoting, and people are calling her out. Right, yes, yoga is a way to care for our body and to be mindful and things like that, but it's important to understand like its roots and to also recognize where it came from, whatever practice it is, right? Even hula, right? Hula dancing, Polynesian dancing, the movement is storytelling. It carries history and it carries meaning. And when you carry that meaning with you out of respect, then the healing that you get from it also is a lot deeper. It's a lot soothing for you and where the community is coming from. Even if it's hip hop, right? We see on here, this is not Ruby Ibarra. If y'all know beat rock, who knows beat rock? All right, cool. This is Rocky Rivera, right? She comes from a culture that respects hip hop, women in hip hop, right? And decolonizes that through storytelling and other means. Any other notes, comments?
I can chat about the intergenerational. So, creating intergenerational healing versus intergenerational trauma versus intergenerational strengths. So this is something, once again, personally that I'm working with myself. So a lot of our families, whether they're first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation, there is work, there's actually a book out called The Mother Wound, where it talks about on the women's side, but even for male or masculine energy, there are those things that we do carry through. Once again, I'm first generation, and so our parents always want us to do better than them. Myself, I want my children to not have to work as hard as I have in the current situation I have. So by understanding what they went through, looking at what the lens of how my parents grew up, you know, it was post-World War II, very scarce, a lot of colorism. My dad is darker skinned, my mom is lighter skinned. There are a lot of different things in the society. Dad was the eldest son, so he was supporting the family back in the Philippines when he came here to the United States. By looking at those, I now understand better what my parents have gone through. I'm finally at a point now in my life where I can have conversations, and we were just talking about this during the break. It's still uncomfortable talking with my dad about some of these things. And for him, it was really more of just a survival mode for him. I actually had 2 older daughters from my first marriage, and I was a teen mom when I had them. And with my older girls, now in their 30s, having conversations with them, I don't remember intentionally hurting them, but they will tell me about trauma that they experienced with me having to work and stuff. And when I explain to them or I share with them, I was just surviving. And that was what a lot of our families had to do. I have younger kids at home now. Because of the work I've done, I show up better for my younger kids, and my daughter's in their 30s. We've had conversations where they're a little jealous because we have a 2-parent family when I was a single mom back then. But also looking at what your culture and your home and your life brings in strength. And that could be the generational strengths that can bridge that gap between trauma and healing. My parents really put a big emphasis on family comes first. Even at those times that we don't like each other, when something happens, my mom going through dementia and going through they having to go through the care home, my sisters and I have actually grown closer because we're having to share the load with each other. Even in this workshop, we started off with storytelling. We didn't really specifically go into storytelling, but storytelling, once again, is how you share those things that trouble you. We're doing it now. We do it in our TikTok reels, our Instagram feeds. But connecting one-to-one with someone, with your mentees, with each other, really does broaden and make people realize that they're not alone in this process. So, you have the right to define what your self-care is. There are definitely things that are healthier, as we mentioned, making sure that you are choosing things that are safe and healthy for you. So, someone would like to share, or several of you would like to share, what are some of your self-care activities? Or that. K-dramas, after I finished my master's program, I had brain capacity for it, so now that's like cathartic.
And I like going on walks.
And just to kind of, once again, go back to the neurology, neuroscience of things, once again, your emotions are energy. And so by doing those types of activities, walking, dancing, it actually helps you process some of those emotions. How many of you, after you've had a really great cry, you're just like, oh, right? You got all of that emotion out, right? Yeah, totally. Once again, you're processing that emotion, that energy is moving through you, and you're releasing it. Right? Or even, how many of you have ever had the experience where like you've been like holding in the secret or the gossip or whatever, and you're able to finally like talk to somebody, hopefully the person that you heard about, that just kind of alleviates some of that, like you feel like a release in your chest, or you've, just like different areas where your body stores energy. I saw a reel the other day where they're talking about releasing tightness in your hips. can actually create a emotional response. Like you can start crying because you sometimes hold trauma in different parts of your body. I know.
Hips are very emotional, y'all. I'll share. Plants are my self-care. I'm a super plant mama, whether it's growing or processing or making medicine out of it. Yeah, and I guess another note too is self-care also exists on a spectrum too. So it can be self-care as prevention, but also self-care when you're in crisis. So for me, when I'm in crisis, tapping helps. Doing tapping points like this right here. Or P6, if you're familiar with acupuncture, pressing that point. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but yes, tapping, self-hugging, headaches, yes. So when you think about self-care, it's not just, things I do when I want to relax. It's things that I do when I'm in crisis or when someone else is in crisis, helping them identify the form of self-care that works for them.
Drinking water is a very important form of self-care, y'all. Please stay hydrated. You will hear that from me every time you see me.
And sleep. Sleep.
Y'all sleep, especially during midterms and finals, y'all need sleep, please, okay? I already see Ira. Get some sleep.
I know.
I told you where all the couches are across campus. Use them.
Safe napping spaces everywhere. Prevention. Alright, so this is lots of goodies and stuff, free stuff, some not so free stuff, and y'all can take pictures, but we can also, I guess, share this too with your resource center. Yes, these are API resources, right? There's a National Suicide Crisis line, 988. It is now 988. Right, easy to call and text. There's the Asia LifeNet hotline. They offer the languages in Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. I'm really bad with saying words I'm familiar with. Then there's directories, right? A lot of these came from what's called Undocu API Leadership, ALLO. Follow them on Instagram. These are resources that are Undocu API friendly, whether it's sliding scales, it's free, it's vouchers, it's directories, it's education, and it's accessible to those in California. Nice. Claremont resources, right? Again, crisis resources, the Tri-City Navigator team, if you're familiar with that. You don't know what you need right now, call them and tell them what's happening. Whatever you feel safe to tell them is happening, right? There's the crisis line. There is a house shelter for those who know somebody or who are in a situation that's not safe, right? As in domestic violence or similar issues. And then there's what's called NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness in Pomona Valley. Now, are these API friendly? Do they offer these in API languages? I'm not sure. It would be great to find out and put them on blast if they don't offer in API culturally responsive ways. This is Riverside County. This is my work, API community. I work with SSG Asian Pacific Counseling Centers. We offer free counseling services for children to seniors. We serve Mandarin, Tagalog, English, Korean, Viet, Lao, Thai, and Samoan. We do also have 24/7 mental health urgent care centers. These are different from going to the medical ER at hospitals because these are safe spaces to de-escalate, to find resources for medication if you're in sort of that in-between stage of what is going on with my body and my mind. There's also the API Mental Health Resource Center. They do self-care Sundays as well as education outreach. And we both are part of what's called the Asian AM Task Force. We put out coalition meetings, and we also have a document on how to report a hate crime, so a lot of things related to Stop API Hate. And then we're doing a fall program called Kapwa Kabataan Inland Empire. It's Filipino youth to decolonize mental health. Details to be determined, but it's happening soon. And there's this workshop, right? Spiritual strength and suicide prevention. Ooh, hot, juicy topic. And the participants in person can participate in candle making, right? Because September 10 is World Suicide Prevention Day. So light a candle, commemorate and raise awareness. We'll help you through that. And our guests are actually previous Kapwa Kabataan participants from 2020 and 2021. San Bernardino County, is this me too? Yeah, all right, IE. Okay. So if you know anyone in San Bernardino County, this city LA, Pomona, Claremont is not yet San Bernardino County. It is still like LA, even though sometimes it has the 909 area code. But yes, similar to Riverside, they have prevention, early intervention. You just need someone to talk to, you don't know where to go. And then they also have crisis centers too, crisis response teams. I don't know, again, like what languages they offer. This is not my area, but in case you know somebody, because y'all are really close to San Bernardino, if you find yourself in Ladino, this is where you can go.
Yeah, we're giving you all the goods. LA County, you may notice is a little bit more bare. It's actually just because a lot of the resources previously mentioned and what we mentioned next actually overlap. So I don't want to put in like the same duplicate phone numbers. LA Warm Line. Warm Line is a concept where you all heard of like 988 suicide hotline. But if you or someone you know is not at that level, but it's like elevated anxiety and you're not in a crisis essentially, but you need assistance, that's what the warm line is. It's not a hotline, it's a warm line. So it's not there yet. So you can go ahead and call that number. The long acronym, that's LA County Department of Mental Health 24/7 helpline. Is just the very best way to get started on all the resources. That would have been way too long to list on this. In terms of community resources, these are, I narrowed it down to 3 community orgs that I am personally aware of. SIPA, Search to Involve Filipino Americans, is a Filipino American resource center in historic Filipino town. So they have mental health assessments, community programs from children to seniors. Then we also have the Pacific Asian Counseling Services. They have about 4 locations in LA County. And then we mentioned the same organization, NAMI. They're a national organization in general, but Greater LA County is going to be the one for this area. And then I think next is Orange County.
Well, we sure we got you all covered.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm in Orange County, and these are the crisis lines, once again, very similar to what you had. I actually did click on them. You can do the live chats if you do. The Asian American mental health support isn't as vast in Orange County. Really, the biggest one is APIDA. They do partner with some of the Vietnamese and other like Korean areas in Garden Grove, etc. But they usually go under OCAPICA. And then I did find this really great resource, Orange County Student Mental Health, and it actually has a resource directory within that where you can search for specific things for that. So those are different counties. Once again, if your mentees are from different areas, really great resources to pass on to them when it's available. So the wonderful organization that we're a part of is the Filipino American National Historical Society, and really it is to promote the understanding of education enlightenment and appreciation and enrichment of identifying ourselves as Filipino Americans in the United States. It was founded in 1982 by Dr. Dorothy Lego Cordova and Dr. Fred Cordova in Seattle. When I was in high school back in the 90s, I was actually part of the group in Vallejo in Northern California, and before I went to Chico State, the president became a really good friend of ours in that area, and he served as a national president. And a gazillion decades later, here I am as vice president of the organization. Dr. Manolo Pedro is our president, so thank you again for connecting us. And we were founded actually during the pandemic, so for the most part we were virtual for the beginning, and now we're going into a hybrid organization. You can click on the, if you'd like to be a part of it, students are only $10 to join, and it's a great organization to learn about our experiences here in the United States. We also have a FANHS National Museum, and one of our working groups is actually recording oral histories so that we can continue sharing our stories. We are living history right now. Your experiences, you're probably like, whatever, it's not going to be that important. But you all lived in that pandemic with us. Your experiences with your family is part of our history. It is part of where we're at. And so we hope that you are willing to join us in recording your own history, encouraging your family to be a part of it. Claremont University is housing our oral history archive as well as at our National Museum out in Stockton. So we hope that you all decide to join FANHS at some point. We would love for you, if you need resources, things like that, feel free to reach out to us. We have several different working groups, research and education. We have community resources, parenting support, as well as our archival and oral history program. So lots of opportunities. We would love to see generations coming up. I'm actually having my high school students that I advise are going to be joining this group so that we can continue to support each other and bring them up with us as we continue to grow.
There's
References for you if you need anything for reports and things, it's part of this as well. So,
a question I had when we were talking about the self-care was that I feel like a lot of white practitioners, and I guess like other practitioners too, emphasize strategies like mindfulness or deep breathing and all these things that sort of promote using your body as an agent of like alleviating stress or promoting your mental health. And I've just been thinking about this a lot because I feel like for a lot of people of color, people that are oppressed, since so much of that trauma is like interwoven in your body, but like generationally, and just like the fact that it still lives in your body. I was wondering what your opinion is on like how we can use our body to heal trauma, even though it records so much of it too.
that's a deep one. I think we're still learning that.
Oh, do you have anything?
You're excited first.
Thank you so much for your question, by the way. The reason why I'm actually excited about it, I worked with my mentor about a month ago doing we did a 2-hour workshop with women in leadership talking about like healing, like embodiment healing in effects of Asian hate. So I think if anything, it'll be a 2-part question, and I apologize in advance if it just sounds like that I'm externally processing. So mindfulness, it's becoming such a sensationalized word in our society, and even in the psych field, it's almost in a way kind of it kind of gives us a weird edge to it, just because in the Western lens, mindfulness became so almost medicalized. Like we're talking about it in terms of neuroscience, and then the mindfulness is now going into almost into a pop culture sense of like Brene Brown, or hearing about other white leading influencers and talking about that. In terms of what your actual question is, I definitely think I'm noticing, at least in my field, we're talking more about embodiment, just because especially in the mental health field, a lot of what's being told as professional help is talk therapy. That's actually really white and Western. And so even with some of my colleagues, when folks are meeting with clients or leading workshops, they're becoming more active. And so when I was in that workshop with my mentor about a month ago, there was actually an exercise that we did where there's this newer-esque intervention called brain spotting. So, and you actually could do this actually at home, where let's say if everyone were to focus on that clock to your left. So try to find a place where you are, and looking at that, what your brain is actually doing is that it's fixating on that moment, but while that's happening, you're able to actually focus on your trauma. And then so now it's actually kind of using a little bit more of more parts of your body to connect with that trauma. So I'm sharing this just as an example that we're on a trajectory of embodiment becoming more of a way to express mental health, because even though there is still talk of trying to go through your thought patterns, which is still a legitimate thing, there's a momentum for it. We're just not there yet. So that's why you might not even hear too much about it. And I'm only hearing it now, and I've been in the field for a few years now. So hopefully that answered some of your question, and it's definitely out there, and I think it's really beneficial.
Hi. Yeah, there's a lot to that very deep question. First of all, how do we reconcile Western-oriented practices that were inspired by, right? A lot of this mindfulness, loving kindness meditation, right? It comes from some Buddhist traditions, and how often do those practitioners recognize that and say, yeah, we have to go back to those roots. And then just, it is useful though, right? The tapping points, knowing certain acupuncture points, even the herbs too. I'm a firm believer in that. So like self-care is, to me, it's all of those things. And when you look at it holistically, where it's not just like the body, but also the mind, spiritual work, heart work too, right? It's like when one of those things is not as accessible, then we can tap into those other things. When one of them is in trouble, then how do we troubleshoot that? How do we identify the barriers? So like somebody who's very new or, you know, kind of anxious about starting body work, I'd recommend like, you know, just take really small steps and make sure that you're in a safe space and you trust the people that you're working with, right? Safety and trust are very big, no matter what kind of self-care that you're doing.
And for those of you that have never noticed or made the connection, or that you're just realizing the connection between your emotions and your body, one of the things that I have come to learn, and I teach my students, is to learn to catch yourself. So if you kind of notice a pattern, or you notice before you go into something, you start feeling a certain way, pause and reflect. Where, and if you can, see where it shows up in your body. Like we said earlier, anxiety in your stomach is a lot. I get a lot of tension in my neck and shoulders when I'm, you know, because we're like this. My own self-discovery, I started doing Zumba in January, and I had forgotten how much I love to dance, because I've been listening to people for years like, you're too fat, you're too big, you're getting old, what the hell, right? But I needed to do something to get the stress. I'm, once again, special education teacher, lots of work, really, you know, my son has therapy, all this other stuff going on. I had to do something for myself. So find that thing, whether it goes for walks, whether it be just listening to music, you know, and notice where it shows up in your body. Where does joy show up? Have you guys ever thought about that? Where does joy show up in your body? Right? That awareness is really where you can start. And if you notice, you'll feel your body sometimes before you feel the emotion. And it's because we've suppressed it for so long. So start small. You know, this is a process, once again, 4 decades here. I'm kind of jealous, you guys. Like, I didn't start doing this work until I was in my 30s. So the fact that you guys have already, and I love, like, you guys are so smart. Like, oh, amazing. And think about what you're giving to your mentees. Like, what a gift. They're not going to have to stress as hard as you did. Fucking suckers. I'm just kidding. But you, once again, you are uplifting and getting them off to a great start so that they're more successful. And that is such a gift that just gives back to us for being here. So thank you guys so much. I know that we're a little bit over time, but we hope that you guys all just have a wonderful school year ahead, wonderful lives ahead. You know, you are already doing the work, healing yourself, and look at you guys, look at that. And please, and FANHS is open to anybody, all ethnicities, all backgrounds. You know, we just want to share, you know, just our culture and love and what we bring to it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you guys for once again being here, and we'll take care of all of that. But yeah, thanks.